Richmond, Virginia, September 1841. The auction yard reeked of sweat, dust, and fear. Cornelius Blackwood had come looking for strong backs to work his tobacco fields in Halifax County. Nothing special, just more bodies to squeeze profit from. Then he saw him. On the block stood a boy of maybe 15, but already towering a full head above every man around him. 6 feet and still growing. Arms so long his fingertips brushed his knees, hands like shovels. Shoulders so broad his shirt looked ready to split. Even in chains he didn't look like something you owned. He looked like something you should stay the hell away from. The auctioneer was milking it. Gentlemen, feast your eyes. Direct from the Dinka people of Africa, famous for their height. But this one's a marvel even among them. I've seen him carry 600 pounds across a warehouse floor without strain. Men leaned in, half fascinated, half afraid. Cornelius pushed through the crowd until he stood just below the boy. Up close, the size was worse, no better. The shoulders were ridiculous, the muscles dense as carved stone. But what really bothered him were the eyes. Dark, sharp, watching everything, not dull, not broken, measuring. He didn't like the way those eyes looked at him. He liked everything else. Can he work? Cornelius called out, "Work?" The auctioneer laughed. "This Negro does the labor of 3 men. The numbers bounced around in Cornelius's head even before the bidding started. The sheer novelty alone was money. Sunday showings, private demonstrations, wagers. This wasn't just a field hand. This was an investment. 3,000 to start, the auctioneer shouted. 3,500, Cornelius answered. 4,000, someone from South Carolina barked. Cornelius barely hesitated. 4,500. The South Carolinian cursed under his breath and dropped out. Too much risk for a man buying a laborer. But Cornelius wasn't buying labor. He was buying a spectacle, sold to Mr. Cornelius Blackwood of Halifax County for $4,500. The crowd murmured. It was an obscene price for one slave. Cornelius just stared at the boy's hands and thought, "You're going to make me rich." The boy understood almost nothing of the shouted English. He understood the numbers, though. He'd heard those sounds repeated any time the traders talked about good stock. He understood the way men stared at him like he wasn't a person. On the plantation ledger, he would become the most expensive entry Cornelius ever made. On the wagon ride back to Halifax County, the boy sat chained and silent, iron biting his wrists and ankles. He listened, memorizing sounds, attaching meanings to them. Plantation, tobacco, giant. He said nothing. There was no point in speaking to men who only saw price tags. His African name never even had a chance. That night, Cornelius showed off his new prize like a hunting trophy. At dinner, the boy stood in the corner of the dining room, shackled, towering so high his head nearly brushed the ceiling. The house slaves kept sneaking glances at him, unable to hide their curiosity and unease. Cornelius carved his meat with the easy confidence of a man who owned other human beings and thought that was normal. "Gentlemen," he said to no one in particular, "we needed a proper name for our new acquisition. Something fitting." He smirked. "So I've decided to call him Goliath, the giant who got knocked down by a little shepherd boy. Seems appropriate, doesn't it?" His wife Constance chuckled. The younger son, Jacob, laughed too loudly, already half drunk. The name was a joke to them. Biblical mockery slapped onto a human life without a second thought. Goliath. The word meant nothing to the boy yet, but he understood tone. They thought it was funny. Jacob grabbed a piece of bread and tossed it onto the floor in front of the giant. "Pick that up, giant." "Let's see you bend." Goliath didn't move. Didn't blink. Didn't even look at the bread. I said, "Pick it up." Jacob snarled, face reddening. He grabbed a riding crop from the wall and struck. The first lash snapped across Goliath's shoulders. The second wrapped around his legs. The third was coming when the boy finally turned his head. For a split second, Jacob saw something in those eyes, something ancient and dangerous, that made him step back without meaning to. "That's enough." Cornelius rose, voice controlled but icy. "He cost $4,500. You damage him, you pay for it." Jacob lowered the crop, humiliated. "Yes, father." Goliath said nothing. But he filed away the memory of Jacob's brief fear, like a blade slid into a sheath. They should be afraid, he thought, in a language none of them would ever understand. His new home was the cellar, a stone-floored space with a ceiling just high enough for him to stand upright. They bolted heavy chains to a central beam, and locked him there for the night. The iron collar alone weighed more than some men's entire chains. He touched the welts on his back. They barely hurt. He'd suffered worse on the ship that stole him from home. He knew he'd suffer worse here. He also knew something else. Fear had flickered in Jacob's eyes the moment their gazes met. Good, he thought. Remember that. Within a month, Goliath wasn't just a slave. He was an attraction. Every Sunday after church, the carriages would roll in. Plantation owners, their bored sons, their overdressed wives, they all came to see the monster in chains. Cornelius turned a barn into an arena. Benches arranged in a semicircle, floor cleared, a stage at the center. Goliath was led out in iron so thick it took 3 men to drag the chains. Lift that, Cornelius ordered, pointing to a cotton bale that weighed more than most men. Goliath lifted. Gasps. Nervous laughter. Women fanned themselves with a little too much excitement. A 300-pound bale on one shoulder. Then a full water barrel overhead. Then whatever else Cornelius thought would impress the crowd. They clapped like it was a magic trick. Then came the fights. Who wants to see 3 men take down the giant? Cornelius would call. There were always volunteers. Young overseers desperate to prove themselves. Plantation sons full of whiskey and stupidity. Once in a while a professional fighter looking for fame. 3 men. No weapons. If they won, they split $50. If Goliath won, he got more food. Goliath always won. They bloodied his face, cracked his ribs, knocked him back. 3 normal men could hurt even a giant. But Goliath was patient. He took the blows, waited for someone to get cocky, to overextend. Then one hand would flash out, close around a throat, and a grown man would hang in the air kicking like a child. The others would rush in. He'd swat them aside, just short, brutal movements that threw them across the ring. Almost every Sunday ended the same, spectators cheering, at least one white man unconscious, and Cornelius Blackwood richer from the bets he'd placed on his creature. That was the word he used most often. Creature, specimen, investment, never man. Monday through Saturday the show was over. The real work began. Halifax County's tobacco fields were hell in August. The air didn't move. By 9 in the morning, the heat sat on the skin like a wet blanket. 50 field hands bent at the waist moved through the rows, cutting and bundling leaves under Overseer Thornton's whip. Goliath didn't work like they did. While others carried maybe 40 pounds at a time, he hauled 300, sometimes 4. Bundles stacked on his back so high that the other slaves couldn't see his head. Only the sway of the load and the deep prints his feet left in the soil. "Move faster, giant!" Thornton shouted, cracking the whip against Goliath's shoulders. The leather cut into the skin already mapped with scars. Goliath's pace never changed. He just walked, one massive step after another, as if nothing in the world could push him to hurry. When the others drank water at noon, he got less time. When the others returned to the quarters at dusk, he kept working, loading carts, shifting equipment, digging the kind of trench that normally took 6 men. At night, they locked him alone in the barn. Special chains thicker than a man's wrist. Iron collar, bolts sunk deep into the main support beam. His food dumped into a trough on the floor. It was the way you fed an animal, and that was the point. The first year, he focused on one thing only: survive. The second year, as the English words started to make more sense, he began to understand how casually they spoke about him, how Cornelius discussed him like a mule or a plow, how visitors referred to him as it. The third year, something inside him hardened. The spark in his eyes dimmed. Hope, whatever version of it he'd still been holding, sank out of sight. The other slaves noticed Uncle Moses, an old field hand who'd been enslaved longer than most of them had been alive, watched the giant carefully. "That one's dangerous," Moses murmured one night in the quarters, keeping his voice low. "I've seen that look before. Saw it on Nat Turner's face back in 31. Right before Southampton ran with white blood," young Samuel snorted. "He barely talks. Just works, eats, sleeps. That's it. That's what makes him dangerous," Moses replied. "He's thinking, planning, waiting. Waiting for what?" Moses shook his head. "Pray we never find out." Years blurred together. Work, chains, fights, more work, more chains. Goliath learned their language, but he rarely used it. Better to let them believe he understood less than he did. Easier to listen that way. Easier to study them, their habits, their patterns, their weaknesses. He knew who beat their slaves for fun and who only beat them for discipline. He knew which sons were cowards and which had just enough backbone to be dangerous. He knew the layout of the plantation without ever needing a map. He also knew one simple truth. They thought he was broken. They thought all those years of chains and humiliation had turned him into what they wanted: obedient flesh, a walking machine built for lifting, hauling, and entertaining them. They were wrong. Underneath the scars and silence, under the iron collar and the Sunday performances, something was still alive and watching, waiting. Halifax County, 1845. 4 years since the auction. 4 years of chains, beatings, and spectacle. The morning started like any other. Fog curling low over the tobacco fields, overseers barking orders, whips cracking rhythm into the labor. But the air had changed. The plantation dogs wouldn't stop barking. Birds had gone silent. Cornelius Blackwood didn't notice. He was too busy counting barrels. Inside the barn, Goliath stood chained as always. Iron collar, wrists bound, ankles locked. The wood around the bolts was worn from years of strain. Splintered but never broken. Not yet. Thornton, the overseer, swaggered in with 2 field hands behind him. He carried a new whip, longer and thicker than the last. He'd named it Judgment. You know what today is, giant? Thornton sneered, circling him like a man teasing a bear in a cage. Visitors coming, big ones. Master wants you clean, wants you obedient. Goliath said nothing. His eyes followed every move. Thornton lashed him once hard across the back. Blood welled up and ran down the scars that had never really healed. The 2 field hands flinched. They'd seen Goliath take hundreds of lashes without reaction, but there was something in the air now. Something electric, dangerous. The second lash came. The third. On the fourth, Goliath's breathing changed. Slow, deep, controlled. Thornton noticed too late. The 5th lash cracked, but before it finished echoing, the chain on Goliath's left wrist snapped. The sound wasn't metal breaking. It was wood exploding. The support beam that had held him for years split clean in half. Dust filled the air. Thornton stumbled back, staring as the impossible happened. The 2nd chain went next. Then the 3rd. Goliath straightened to his full height, shoulders rolling, the iron collar still locked but everything else hanging useless from his wrists like jewelry. Thornton's whip slipped from his hand. "Stay back," he shouted, fumbling for the pistol on his hip. He didn't get the chance to draw. Goliath's hand shot out, closed around Thornton's throat, and lifted him clean off the ground. The overseer kicked and clawed, face turning purple, eyes bulging. Goliath's expression never changed. The neck broke with a dull snap. The 2 field hands froze. One dropped to his knees, whispering prayers. The other turned and ran screaming toward the main house. Goliath stood over Thornton's body for a moment, breathing steady, blood running down his back. Then he reached down, picked up the fallen pistol, and walked out into the sunlight. The alarm spread like wildfire. By the time Cornelius heard the shouting, Goliath was already in the yard. Slaves scattered from the fields, terrified, not of him but of what would follow. White men with rifles poured out of the house, shouting orders that overlapped into chaos. "Shoot him!" The first bullet grazed his shoulder. The second hit his chest and didn't slow him down. He tore through the yard like an avalanche, a mountain of muscle and fury. A rifle butt smashed against his jaw. He swung back and sent the man flying into a wagon. Cornelius himself came out with a shotgun, face pale, hands trembling. He aimed, fired, and hit nothing but air. Goliath was already on him. "Back, you beast!" Cornelius screamed, trying to reload. Goliath grabbed the barrel and bent it like tin. The old man stumbled back, tripping over a porch step. For the first time, Cornelius Blackwood, the man who'd bought and named him, was looking up at him. "Please," Cornelius gasped, voice cracking. "I can pay you, I can—" Goliath didn't even let him finish one blow. A single, crushing swing that caved in his chest like wet clay. The great Cornelius Blackwood was dead before he hit the ground. The plantation burned that night. No one knew who set the fires. Maybe Goliath. Maybe someone who saw their only chance for freedom. Flames swallowed the barn, the stables, the house. Smoke rose into the sky like a signal to the rest of the South. Something had broken loose. By dawn, half the county was searching for him. Posse after posse rode out, dogs tracking the blood trail that led into the woods. They found bodies, 2 riders crushed against trees, another with his skull caved in, but no giant. For weeks they hunted. Nothing. It was as if the earth itself had swallowed him. Months later, rumors began. Some said they'd seen a massive figure wandering the swamps at night, covered in scars, wearing broken chains like ornaments. Others swore he'd joined a maroon camp deep in the woods, leading escaped slaves like a phantom. A few said he'd crossed into the mountains and disappeared forever. None of it could be proven. The only certainty was this: the Blackwood plantation was gone, and somewhere out there, a giant once known as Goliath was still alive, silent, waiting, and free for the first time in his life. North Carolina border, 1848. 3 years after the fire, the locals still whispered his name, though none dared say it too loud. Goliath, the black giant, the Swamp King, a ghost story for white men and a prayer for the enslaved. Whispers in the woods, the dismal swamp stretched for miles, black water, choking vines, cypress roots twisting like claws. Most men wouldn't step 10 feet in without a guide. But the runaways who made it here didn't need one. They followed the rumors. They said a giant lived deep inside, guarding the free. He came out only when patrols got too close, and when he did, the woods went silent. Dogs wouldn't bark. Guns misfired. Men disappeared. One such night, a patrol of 5 slave catchers pushed too far into the swamp. They found an abandoned campfire and thought they were close to a group of runaways. The leader, Pike, a vicious drunk, was already picturing the bounty. Then something moved in the trees, big. Too big. Show yourself, Pike shouted. Branches cracked behind him. He spun. Nothing. Then another sound. Footsteps, slow and heavy like thunder muffled by mud. He never saw the blow coming. Just a massive hand in the dark, and then his skull met the trunk of a cypress with a sound like splitting wood. The others fired wildly. Smoke filled the air. One bullet grazed something that growled low and deep. Then the shape was gone. When morning came, only 2 men stumbled out alive, one half mad, the other swearing he'd seen the devil himself, 2 the Maroons by. The time the winter of 1848 hit, hundreds of escaped slaves were hiding in the swamps, living in camps built on platforms above the water. They called themselves the Maroons, and though they had no leader on paper, everyone followed one man, Goliath. He didn't speak much. His English was rough, his voice low like gravel. But when he did speak, they listened. He taught them how to move without leaving tracks, how to hunt with traps instead of noise, how to strike and vanish before anyone could reload a rifle. He'd built a small fortress in the swamp's heart, a cabin of stone and fallen logs, ringed with sharpened stakes. No patrol ever found it. Some said he'd carved tunnels through the mud, that the swamp itself protected him. To the people he sheltered, he wasn't a monster anymore. He was a savior carved from vengeance. Children laughed around the fires again. Women sang the old songs. And when someone new stumbled into the swamp, half dead from the chase, Goliath himself would lift them from the mud and say, "Do you free now?" 3. The hunter's freedom never lasts unchallenged. In the spring of 1849, a new posse formed, this time funded by plantation owners from 3 counties. They brought dogs, torches, and a professional tracker from Georgia named Silas Crane. Crane wasn't like the others. He didn't believe in ghost stories. He believed in killing. He studied the patterns, the timing of raids on plantations, the missing patrols. He mapped it all and found the center point. Not a ghost, he told them. A man. And I'm going to find him. By June, the hunt began. They rode into the swamp with 20 men and didn't come out for 3 days. On the second night, they heard drums, slow rhythmic echoing through the mist. Crane's men fired into the dark. The dogs panicked. By dawn, half the posse was gone. When they finally found Goliath, he wasn't hiding. He stood knee-deep in water, bare-chested, iron collar still around his neck, a rusted chain dangling from it like a trophy. Crane raised his rifle. "You the devil they talk about?" Goliath said nothing. "Speak, damn you." Goliath's reply came like thunder. "Not devil, just man." The first shot missed. The second hit his shoulder. He didn't flinch. Then he charged. The fight was short and brutal. Crane fired again, but Goliath was already on him. The rifle snapped in 2. A hand like stone gripped Crane's throat and forced him underwater. Bubbles. Silence. The last thing Crane saw before the world went black was those same eyes. Cold. Intelligent, unbroken. The price of freedom. When the few surviving hunters returned, they brought nothing but fear. The swamp was declared cursed. No one entered again for years, but for the enslaved across the south, word spread like wildfire. There was a place where the chains couldn't reach, a place where a giant walked free, where white men died and black men lived. Plantations whispered of him like a nightmare. Runaways whispered of him like a promise. And deep in the dismal swamp, under the sound of frogs and wind through the trees, the legend of Goliath grew into something more than a man. He had no army, no country, no God but freedom, and he would rather live in mud and blood than ever kneel again. Dismal Swamp, summer 1852. 3 years had turned the legend into something worse than fear, belief. Fire in the fields, it started small. A supply wagon burned to ash outside of Halifax. A tobacco barn found empty. Its slaves gone, its overseer dead. A few thought it was coincidence. But then 3 plantations fell within a single month, crops torched, masters vanished. The men who escaped told the same story, a shadow in the trees, a voice from the dark saying, "Run, don't look back." Those who looked back didn't live long enough to describe what they saw. The newspapers called it the Goliath Rebellion. They said an army of escaped slaves was gathering under the command of a monstrous Negro, 10 feet tall, impervious to bullets, half man, half beast. The truth was simpler and far more dangerous. Goliath had learned war. The Swamp Kingdom, what began as a few scattered camps, had become a network, hundreds strong, stretching from Virginia into North Carolina. Every group of runaways had a code. 1 beat on a tree trunk meant safe, 2 meant danger, 3 meant run. Goliath didn't lead them like a general. He led them like a storm. He struck where they least expected, bridges, storehouses, patrol stations, and vanished back into the trees. He trained them with stolen weapons and field tools turned into blades. Some of the freedmen called him King of the Swamp. He hated the title. "No kings here," he told them one night as the rain hammered the roof of their hidden camp. "Kings got slaves, we got brothers." The firelight caught his scars, deep and shining like iron brands. The collar still hung around his neck, not as restraint but reminder. 3. The price of blood freedom had a cost. The more victories they won, the harder the retaliation hit. Slave catchers came in larger groups now. Soldiers, bounty men, even militias. They brought dogs, torches, and cannons into the swamp. When they couldn't find Goliath, they punished the nearest plantations, hanging anyone suspected of helping runaways. The air smelled of smoke and death. Goliath carried the weight of it in silence. Some nights he walked the edge of camp, staring into the dark, whispering in his mother tongue. Prayers no one understood. Then he'd turn back to his people and say the same thing. We stop when they stop. The colonel in 1853, the state, hired Colonel Nathaniel Graves, a veteran of the Seminole Wars. Graves wasn't a drunk like the bounty men before him. He studied maps, built boats for shallow water, cut paths through the reeds. Monsters bleed, he told his men. You just have to catch them first. He made progress. One by one, he found and burned the outer camps. Dozens captured, some executed on the spot, but Goliath never appeared until the Battle of Dead Cypress. The Battle of Dead Cypress Graves had followed a trail of footprints, enormous ones, to a clearing near a drowned grove. He thought he had him cornered. "Form up!" he barked. 50 men with rifles surrounding the heart of the swamp. The silence was wrong. No birds, no insects, just fog. Then came the sound, a low hum, hundreds of voices. The Maroons stepped out from the mist, weapons glinting. At their center stood Goliath, barefoot, shirtless, chains wrapped around his fists. Graves hesitated, just a breath, and that was enough. The first volley tore through the mist and hit nothing. The swamp exploded with movement, spears from the reeds. Arrows from the trees. The soldiers fired blind while shadows closed in. Goliath hit them like thunder, ripping a man off his feet, swinging the corpse into another. The chain around his arm cracked bones like kindling. When Graves finally saw him up close, he understood why they called him Goliath. Not for his size, though he was massive, but for his will. The look in his eyes was not hate. It was judgment. Graves fired point blank. The bullet grazed Goliath's jaw. He swung once, a single blow, and Graves went down, skull caved in. The remaining soldiers fled into the dark. By morning, nothing was left but corpses and the smell of gunpowder. Aftermath. The newspapers said the army had dispersed the rebellion. They lied. The swamp swallowed its dead and went silent again. But the plantations never recovered. Laborers escaped in waves. Overseers quit. Even bounty hunters refused to take contracts south of the Dismal. They said the giant still watched from the trees. Maybe he did. Because sometimes, on nights when the moon hung low and the air stank of rot, travelers swore they heard a deep voice in the distance whispering in the dark, "Free. Stay free." Virginia, 1863. The Civil War had come, but the swamp had seen war long before. To the Union Army, the Dismal Swamp was just another patch of cursed land on the border between Virginia and North Carolina. To those who lived in its shadows, it was sacred ground. The Bluecoats Captain Elias Moore had heard the stories since childhood. Every Southern boy had a giant in the swamp, the runaway killer, the demon who broke his chains. Now Moore was 33, wearing Union blue, leading the 10th Colored Infantry through the same land he'd once feared. His men were ex-slaves, scouts, and freedmen, some born in the swamp itself. They whispered when the fog got too thick. "Captain," one of them said quietly, "you know who lives out here, don't you?" Moore smiled grimly. "If he's still alive, I hope he's on our side." Signs in the mud 2 days in. The unit began finding signs. Traps made from sharpened bone. Trails cut in places no white soldier would ever find. Handprints, massive, bare, still fresh. At night, something circled their camp. They heard branches creak under weight too heavy for an animal. One man swore he saw eyes glinting in the dark, too high off the ground. By the third night, they knew they weren't alone. Moore ordered a watch, but when dawn came, half their food was gone, and every gunpowder barrel had been moved 50 yards away. Not stolen, just moved, a warning. The meeting had happened on the 4th evening. Fog thick as smoke rolled over the camp, and from it stepped a shape that filled the world. 7 feet tall, built like a tree trunk, wrapped in rags and scars. The iron collar still hung around his neck, but now it was engraved with marks, lines and notches like some kind of record. Goliath. The soldiers froze. One raised his rifle. Moore stopped him with a hand. The giant studied them in silence, eyes deep and calm. "You fight them?" he finally asked, voice low and slow. "Yes," Moore said carefully. "We fight the Confederates." "For freedom." Goliath nodded once. "Good." Then he turned and started walking. After a few steps, he stopped and looked back. Come, the hidden camp. They followed him deep into the swamp where even maps failed. There, between the cypress trees, stood an entire hidden settlement. Huts, gardens, even a forge. Men, women, and children, hundreds of them, all free. The Maroon Kingdom still lived. Moore stared, speechless. These people had survived in isolation for over 20 years, unseen, unfed by any army, untouched by any master. Goliath led him to a clearing where a massive oak stood, burned and hollowed, but still alive. Beneath it were carved hundreds of names. "Everyone who made it," the giant said. "Everyone who died here." Moore removed his cap. For the first time in months of war, he felt something like reverence. The Alliance, the Union, needed guides through Confederate territory, and the Maroons knew every hidden path, every forgotten road. Goliath agreed to help, but only on one condition. "No chains," he said. "No man owns no man," Moore nodded. "That's what we're fighting for." For the next year, Goliath's people became the Union's invisible edge. They guided raids, freed prisoners, sabotaged supply lines. Southern officers began whispering again, the ghost army of the swamp. And always at the front of those attacks was the giant himself. Bullets seemed to miss him. Men swore he could lift a cannon by himself. But those who saw him up close said he fought not with rage, but with purpose. As if every strike was a memory made flesh. The end of Chains, April 1865. News of Lee's surrender reached even the swamp. Drums beat. Voices sang. The war was over. Captain Moore returned months later with official documents. Freedom by law this time. But when he reached the camp, the people were gone. The huts were empty, the fires cold. Only one thing remained. The old iron collar, resting at the base of the oak tree, split clean down the middle. Moore stood there for a long time, then said softly, Guess you didn't need papers. Legacy years passed. The swamp reclaimed the land. Travelers still told stories of a giant who freed the enslaved, who vanished into the fog the day freedom came. Some said he died there, buried beneath the roots of the old oak. Others swore they saw him in Carolina, helping build a church, his back still scarred, his eyes still watchful, but no grave was ever found. Only the legend remained. A man once called Goliath who rose from chains, built a kingdom in mud, and made the South remember fear. Carolina Lowlands, 1871. 6 years since the war ended, and peace was just another lie men told themselves to sleep at night. The Union had won, but the South was still rotting, full of ghosts that refused to die. The teacher, Clara Bennett, rode alone, pistol on her hip and papers in her satchel. She was 26, a freedwoman from Philadelphia, sent south by the Freedmen's Bureau to teach the newly emancipated how to read and count. Most white men spat when she passed. Some didn't bother hiding their rifles. Every mile deeper into Carolina felt like another dare from God. But she wasn't stupid. She'd heard the stories too. Every freed school teacher did. A man in the swamps, a giant who'd never bowed. They said he'd fought in the war, freed slaves before Lincoln ever signed a paper, then vanished like smoke. Most thought he was a myth until the day she met him. The stranger in the pines, the children were the first to notice. They'd been playing behind the church when one ran in, eyes wide. "Teacher, there's a man outside. Big one." Clara stepped out, hand on her pistol. The sun was low, the road empty, except for a figure standing at the edge of the trees. He was enormous. Grey in the beard, shoulders like a bull, a ragged coat hanging from him like a curtain. He stood perfectly still, watching her schoolhouse. Clara called out, "You lost, sir?" He didn't answer. He just pointed at the carved sign above the door. "First Colored School of Halifax County." "You built this?" he asked. His voice was deep but rough, like gravel underfoot. "I teach here," she said carefully. "Built it with help from the community." He nodded. His eyes moved over the building, small, crooked, but standing. "Good, you do more than fight." Then he turned to leave. "Wait," she called. "What's your name?" He paused. The wind rustled the trees. "Name's gone. Don't need it no more." And just like that, he walked back into the forest. The return over the next month, the giant came back 3 times. Never stayed long. Brought food once, deer meat wrapped in cloth. Another time, timber for repairs. He never sat, never accepted water, never said where he lived. But the children adored him. They called him Uncle G because they couldn't pronounce Goliath. Clara knew the truth before he said it. "You're him," she whispered one evening as he stood in the doorway, watching the sunset over the fields. "The one from the stories. The giant who freed people." He didn't deny it, just looked at her with tired eyes. "That was long ago," he said. "Freedom's harder to keep than to win." The night riders one night, the world reminded her what he meant. The clan came. 12 men in white sheets. Torches burning, voices slurred with whiskey and hate. They surrounded the schoolhouse, shouting for the Yankee teacher to come out. Clara barred the door, heart hammering. The children huddled inside, whispering prayers. A torch hit the roof. Fire caught fast. She grabbed a bucket, but it was useless. Smoke filled the room. Then came the sound and heavy, deliberate steps outside. The kind that made the ground itself flinch. "Who's there?" One of the riders barked. The answer came like thunder. A hand grabbed him by the throat and threw him into the dirt. Another rider raised a pistol. It vanished into the dark with him. The horses screamed. Torches dropped. Chaos erupted. Clara ran outside and saw him, the giant moving through firelight like a shadow of God. No sword, no gun. Just his bare hands, and that old iron collar tied to his wrist like a weapon. When it was over, half the riders lay broken, the rest fled into the woods. The school burned to the ground, but the children lived. Goliath stood in the ashes, breathing slow. "They never stop," he said quietly. "Always come again." Clara touched his arm, hard as oak, scarred deep. "Then we keep standing." For the first time she saw something close to a smile. The end of the giant. Weeks later, the Freedmen's Bureau sent troops. They found no trace of the attackers. Only blood, burned wood, and a single iron collar half buried in the mud. Clara told them what happened, but they didn't believe her. "Mom," the officer said, "that man's been dead for years." Died in the war. She didn't argue, just looked toward the trees and said, maybe he did. The legend lives years later when Clara was an old woman. She'd tell her students that freedom wasn't given. It was guarded. And when they asked who guarded it first, she'd point toward the swamp and say, a man who was once a slave, then a soldier, then something more. He kept his chains so we wouldn't wear ours. Some of them laughed. Some believed. But every now and then, a traveler passing through the dismal swamp swore they saw footprints in the mud, too wide for any man, leading nowhere. The war ended. The schools were built. The South changed. Slowly, painfully, never fully. But the legend of the giant never died because some men live only once, and others become the kind of truth that never needs proof. Dismal Swamp, North Carolina, 2021. 170 years after the fire, the land still smelled of rot and silence. The tourists never came this far in. They stayed near the boardwalks and nature trails. Only one person walked deeper, a historian named Dr. Caleb Hightower. He wasn't looking for beauty. He was looking for proof. The researcher Caleb was 38, black, and tired of reading whitewashed footnotes about minor slave uprisings. He wanted something real, something that couldn't be edited out of textbooks. The legend of Goliath of Halifax had haunted the margins of every archive he'd ever read. A runaway slave, a giant, a rebel king in the swamp. Most historians dismissed it as folklore, but then he found it, a letter from 1864, written by Union Captain Elias Moore to the Freedmen's Bureau. We encountered a settlement of freedmen led by a man immense in stature. He bears an iron collar engraved with names of the lost. He commands loyalty by virtue, not violence. Moore had even drawn a rough sketch, a towering man with a broken chain. Caleb stared at the faded paper and muttered, "All right, Goliath, let's see if you were real." The Findit took 2 months of digging through mud, snakes, and bureaucracy before he found it, an unmarked mound beneath a collapsed cypress tree, miles from any trail. Ground-penetrating radar showed something metallic below. He knelt, shovel in hand, sweat dripping. The first strike hit wood, the second hit iron. When the mud cleared, he saw it, a rusted collar, split clean down the middle. Inside, engraved in uneven letters, was a list of names. Not slave tags, names. And at the bottom, barely legible, "Free, stay free." Caleb sat back, heart pounding. For a moment, he didn't care about fame or grants or papers. He just stared at that collar and felt the weight of it. Centuries of silence, broken by one man's will. 3, the burial. They called in an excavation team. Under the roots they found bones, massive, long-limbed, scarred. The forensic anthropologist measured the femur twice, thinking it was a mistake. 7'2", maybe 7'4", she said. African male, mid-60s when he died. Evidence of old gunshot wounds and healed fractures. Caleb whispered, "Jesus Christ, he was real." The news spread fast. "The Giant of the Swamp," headlines called him. Smithsonian offered funding, universities sent letters, talk shows wanted interviews. But Caleb didn't care about any of that. He only wanted the story told right, not a monster, not a myth. A man who'd torn himself free and built freedom out of mud and fear. The visitor, that night after the press left, Caleb stayed alone by the dig site. The swamp hummed with frogs and wind. He read the names from the collar out loud, one by one. The air felt heavy, listening. When he finished, something moved in the darkness. Slow, deliberate steps, too heavy for any animal. Caleb froze. The sound stopped. Then, faintly, from somewhere deep in the trees came a low voice. Calm, deep, familiar, though it couldn't possibly be real. "Tell it true." And then silence again. Caleb didn't move for a long time. He didn't have to. He knew exactly what the voice meant. 5, the legacy. Months later, the Smithsonian exhibit opened. Goliath, the man who would not bow. The centerpiece wasn't his bones. It was the collar, cleaned, preserved, displayed beneath the words he'd carved. Visitors walked past in silence. Some cried, some just stared, and for the first time in almost 2 centuries the world said his name out loud again, not as a legend, but as history. In the dark of the swamp, the wind moved through the cypress trees like a whisper. Free. Stay free. And somewhere, maybe in the sound of the rustling water or in the tremble of the earth itself, it almost sounded like the giant was still walking. Washington, D.C., and 2023. 2 years after the discovery, the country still couldn't decide what to do with Goliath. The storm the Smithsonian exhibit broke records and started a war. For every person who walked out inspired, another came out furious. Conservative pundits called it revisionist history. Southern heritage groups protested outside the museum, waving Confederate flags and shouting that the giant never existed, or if he did, he was a murderer, not a hero. Caleb Hightower watched it all from behind bulletproof glass in his office. He'd given up interviews months ago. Every question had turned into an argument. Was Goliath a freedom fighter or a terrorist? Should his remains be reburied in Arlington or returned to Virginia? Do you consider him the first American rebel? He stopped answering. Truth didn't need permission to exist. The rewriting textbooks changed, slowly, reluctantly. In North Carolina, a few school boards banned the chapter altogether. Others quietly rewrote it. They couldn't erase him now, so they softened him. An unusually tall escaped slave known as Goliath was rumored to have lived in the dismal swamp, aiding fugitives on the Underground Railroad, rumored. Always that word. As if the collar, the bones, the records didn't matter. Caleb slammed the book shut the first time he saw it in print. Rumor, he muttered. They'll lie forever before they admit a black man led a war on their soil. But then he caught himself. The exhibit was still standing. People were still coming. Children still whispered his name. That mattered more than the spin. The senator one night, he was invited to a private dinner, hosted by a U.S. senator from Virginia, a man with old money and older politics. You've made quite a stir. Dr. Hightower, the senator said over wine, your giants become a rallying cry for all sorts of movements. Caleb's jaw tightened. He's not mine. He belongs to history. The senator smiled, the kind of smile that never reached the eyes. History belongs to whoever writes it. Caleb left before dessert. That night, he filed a petition to have Goliath's remains reburied where he'd been found, in the swamp, not in the capital. The return, the ceremony was small. No cameras, no press, no speeches, just a handful of people who understood. They buried the bones beneath the same cypress roots where he'd been found. The collar went with him. Caleb poured the soil himself. When the last shovel of earth hit the grave, a storm broke, rain hammering down in sheets, thunder rolling low across the marsh. The others ran for cover. Caleb didn't move. He stood there, drenched, head bowed. You're home, he said quietly. Somewhere between thunderclaps, he thought he heard the same voice as before. Faint but clear. Tell it true. The echo months later, footage from the burial leaked online. It went viral in hours. Protesters, preachers, teachers, rappers, everyone had an opinion. But what mattered was that people talked, songs were written, murals painted, streets renamed. Children in schools now recited the line carved into the collar, "Free, stay free." And slowly the legend became something larger than history. It became a mirror, forcing America to look at what it had buried. The closing scene a year after the burial, Caleb returned to the swamp alone. No maps, no cameras, just him and the weight of silence. He found the grave again, overgrown and half-swallowed by vines. Fireflies floated above the water like candles. He sat beside it, notebook in hand, and began writing. Not an academic paper this time. Something simpler. He was not a myth. He was a man. He was not a monster. He was a mirror. He was the proof that even in chains, a man can choose what kind of story he leaves behind. He closed the book, laid it on the grave, and whispered the words one last time, "Free, stay free." Then he walked away. Behind him, the swamp was still, but for just a moment, the water rippled, as if something massive had shifted beneath the surface. And somewhere deep in the dark, a low, steady sound began again, the echo of footsteps that refused to stop.